Hello and welcome back to the Life Nurse podcast. Very excited to jump into the topics for this week. I think watch brands are sort of getting into the rhythm of releasing more watches this year. We are getting into the first month of January, we're almost our first month of the year. It's crazy to think that we're almost in February. But some really nice, exciting things that have come out, especially watches that are kind of here to celebrate some of the anniversaries of many of the different brands. And I think that's something that we'll continue to see as we go into 2025, is brands releasing unique, interesting watches that are celebrating the anniversaries that they have. What I'm really excited is a lot of the pieces that have been released that we're going to talk about in this podcast, it seems like they're precursors to other things that the brands might release over the next year. So it's kind of, we can wait with bated breath, but also enjoy the pieces they have released. We're gonna cover a ton of different brands. I'll start off with my favorite, which is MB&F, but we'll talk about some pieces from the likes of Vacheron, Constantin, Omega, Tudor, Oris, to name a couple. As always, there will be links in the show notes of this podcast if you want to read some of the articles or see some of the pieces that we discuss in this specific podcast. There'll be links to all the websites that we are using to provide you this information. I also encourage you to check out those websites more regularly. They really do provide some of the helpful articles and allow you to stay up to date with the things that brands are doing. So I'll start off with MB&F. As I mentioned, this year is a year of celebration for MB&F. It's their 20th birthday. They kicked off their birthday with limited edition pieces of 20 each in two of probably arguably their two pieces that really are an example of incredible watchmaking for the brand. And what's really cool is both these pieces come in a case metal that's not very common for MB&F, and that's in stainless steel. And it also features a little bit of a design element that was part of their history and was is a very unique part unique design decision that they had. So I'll read to you kind of their release and also give you a little bit more information. So the two pieces that they have released are the LM Perpetual Longhorn and the LM Sequential Flyback Longhorn. Now, if you don't know what the Longhorn concept is referring to, it actually was first born in 2009 during the design phase of the LM1, which was MB&F's first legacy machine. And essentially what the Longhorn is referring to is the fact that the original design of these cases had longer lugs, which are coined as horns, which are quite pleasing at design, like aesthetically and in the way that they're designed. The issue with them is the fact that they're so long makes it difficult to identify where spring bars can be placed, because if you had it further away from the case, then it might be a little bit uncomfortable. But if you because it might fit a little bit big, or it might stretch a little bit too far off the edges of the wrist. But if you have it too close to the wrist, then it would have issues of being uncomfortable, and it really depends on the wrist size of the wearer. So what they basically did was they decided and opted for a shorter lug or shorter horns on their specific pieces. Now, moving up to 2021, for their 10th anniversary of the LM1, they had closed the series, but one prototype remained to mark a very important milestone. And so what they ended up doing was fitting an LM1 with these long horns. And this one-of-a-kind piece that was made in stainless steel was auctioned off for charity. And I think what was really great about this auction success is it showed that there was some interest in the Longhorn design on the cases of their legacy machines. And this kind of led up to the return of these Longhorns this year for these two pieces. So as I mentioned, the first example that they're going to make in 20 pieces is their LM Perpetual Longhorn, which obviously won a GPHG award for perpetual calendars when it was first released in 2015, and is, in my view, one of the best perpetual calendars ever manufactured. It was in collaboration with Stephen McDonald. We've covered this extensively, but it is the way that it is built allows it to eliminate the drawbacks of sort of a conventional perpetual calendar And I think it alleviates a lot of the stress that you have on movements. And so what he essentially did was he created this mechanical processor which avoids skipping dates and jamming gears as the adjuster would the adjuster pushers would automatically deviate when the calendar changes. And so I think it's a great celebration of incredible ingenuity. I think the way that McDonald kind of describes it is the way that most of those perpetual calendars are manufactured is based off of like a 31-day gear, but what he ended up doing instead was, I think, basing it off of a 28-day gear and basically adding on top of that. So you wouldn't have, I think, as much as many issues with essentially the movement having to count backwards. It would basically count forwards. So a really incredible bit of ingenuity. Won a GPHG award, and the Longhorn design looks incredible. There's going to be a link for you to see, but really, it changes the shape completely, and I completely understand how they would describe it. The second piece is their LM sequential flyback Longhorn, which was their first chronograph watch to ever be produced and won the GPHG Aiguille d'Or in 2022. And this was also a Stephen McDonald creation and was their first ever chronograph, which was their 20th caliber that they had released. And what was really significant about the innovation that went into this watch was their combination of timing models thanks to what they call the twin-verter binary switch, which allowed for independent timing, split-second, cumulative, and lap timer modes. And so you had this incredibly well-constructed chronograph with a very innovative mechanism. They made this in an Evo version, which added a flyback functionality to it, and now they have this version which has the Longhorns, blued hands, and glossy black subdials, which is really incredible. Again, also made in 20 pieces. These are really beautiful to see. The color combination is also really great. I like the black and the blue in support of sort of the stainless steel case. I think it looks very, very nice, and is a nice sort of nod to a design element that they put together previously, but got a lot of great feedback from collectors and enthusiasts about these watches. Very, very, very nice, and a great way to celebrate 2025 and their birthday of 20 years. They do mention in their releases that they've kicked off the two limited editions, or they've kicked off this birthday celebration with these two limited editions. So I'm waited with bated breath if they're going to come out with something else, and of course we'll cover it on the channel. In the description, you'll be linked to their video where you'll be able to see these pieces kind of in the metal, and they're really, really beautifully done. All right, moving forward, we'll talk about Omega. So Omega, a couple weeks ago released maybe not a couple weeks ago, maybe a week ago, released a new Speedmaster Moonphase Meteorite. Now, if you are interested in watches, you probably have heard of things like the Rolex Meteorite dials that you've seen across multiple social medias, maybe on some people's wrists, and it seems like Omega has done something similar. What's really cool about this version of them is they've kind of not redesigned the case, but it's a different case construction than probably the typical Omega Speedmaster that you're going to buy from their standard model. Essentially what you have is a Speedmaster chronoscope base with the functionalities of the Speedmaster Moonphase on top. And with that, you've also got a Meteorite dial and then Moon cabochon, which is quite cool. So it's a 43 millimeter cased watch, very similar to the chronoscope, and 1 millimeter larger than the Omega Moon watch. It is also it's smaller than the Speedy Moon automatic, which is kind of an interesting sort of switch. And then you've also got a little bit of the thickness is about 14 millimeters, 13.6 millimeters, which is 0.4 millimeters thicker than the Moonwatch Sapphire and 0.6 millimeters thicker than the Chronoscope. A very significant piece of this is that it's 3.3 millimeters slimmer than the previous automatic Speedmaster Moonphase. So strides forward to make something maybe a little bit more wearable, or a little bit more wearable by more people. The watch has your very typical dial configuration. You've got your center chronoscope. You've got your center chronograph hand in the middle. You then got a day indicator, or date, I guess, well, day, excuse me, indicator on the left-hand side, which is going to tell you the day of the month. And then you've got your 12-hour counter at 3 o'clock. You then have a Moonphase, which is really beautiful, at 6 o'clock, and then a Meteorite dial on the that covers the entire watch. So just to go a little bit more into detail about the dial, you essentially have so there's one of the things that they've sort of revamped is the display of the Moonphase. So the first thing that you have is this twin moon display that shows you the Moonphase from the northern and southern hemisphere. That's framed by an age of the moon scale, which is quite interesting. You then have a moon cabochon that are made from genuine pieces of moon meteorite that's over this sort of starry sky that mimics the position of the stars as they were on the night of Apollo 11 when it reached the moon in 1969, which is quite interesting from the view of Biel, Switzerland, which is where Omega is based. The rest of the display is sort of the classic two-counter chronograph with the single register for the elapsing of time, so 60 and 12 hours, and then you have a date hand that's on that subdial at 9 o'clock that I mentioned. There's two variants of this. One has sort of a black tone meteorite dial, and the other one has got sort of these added touches of blue. And I think personally, I kind of like the black dial a little bit more. I think it's a little bit more stealthy, a little bit more aligned with the Speedmaster sort of tradition. But the blue is also a really wonderful example. One of the other things that they revamped with this is a new movement, which is the caliber 9914, which has it shares the technical base with the hand-wound caliber 9908, which is in the Speedmaster chronoscope. And these are hand-wound movements that, well, it's the evolution of the 99 series of the automatic movements, and is a very well manufactured, very good looking movement. If you flip it over, it's a beautiful finishing to it that reminds you of sort of an oyster finish to it. Beautiful looking piece, really large. I would say I'd call it a 3/4 plate, but it's more like a 7/8 plate. You basically have the plate that's finished in this sort of beautiful oyster finishing, and then you've got this you've got the bridge that suspends the balance wheel sort of towards the, let's call it 4 or 5 o'clock. Obviously the finishing is not oyster, it's not a finishing, it's likely guilloche, I think, but a nice sort of pattern to it. I think one of the other things that's fairly new is that I think it's on a new bracelet that is quite beautiful. These pieces are another example, I think, of how brands are trying to experiment with the dials of their watches. You know, a while back we got the Oyster Perpetuals with sort of colorful dials. We got, you know, the puzzle Rolex Datejust. We got that one with the balloons from Rolex. Omega has done similar things where they've kind of experimented with using, or I should say, redesigning watches or redesigning some of their Seamasters with dial colors. Rolex obviously had the Meteorite dials. Omega is kind of doing something similar with their Speedmasters. You kind of have two very iconic brands that are doing more with their dials, and I think that's a way to kind of entice people to look for something that they might be interested in. I think for collectors, I think this would be something very interesting to be part of a collection. I think we can likely say that this is something that's going to continue into the rest of the year. There's a couple other watches that I'm going to discuss, or I think one other watch that I'm going to discuss in this episode of the podcast from another brand. But even if we think about the last podcast that we shot, we discussed the Oris that was inspired, that had that really insanely bright pink dial inspired by Miss Piggy, and then there's the Oris inspired by Kermit. So, these colorful dials, I think, is something that will likely continue, and will give collectors something else to react to might be interested in. If I was to criticize, I said this year I would make sure I had something critical to say about these pieces. There's two ways you could look at this. So the first thing is redesigning the case of this watch is controversial. Omega is known for their Speedmaster. Why would you deviate from something that is iconic and isn't it's not like people are reacting and saying that there's a flaw in the Speedmaster design. However, I think over the life of life on the wrist, I have always said that I find it frustrating when brands come out with the same. They kind of rinse and repeat what they've done in the past and don't really push the boundaries. So I like the fact that they tried to push the boundaries and identify a new way of designing an Omega Speedmaster with a different case, different movement, different dial. So that's kind of a nice step for the brand. So there's kind of two ways that you could criticize them. Maybe they're changing it too much. Maybe they're changing too little because at the same time it's just an Omega Speedmaster. It's an Omega Speedmaster with a different complication, different movement, and they decided to put a new dial to it. Again, these are things that I would like if you wanted to criticize something about these watches, this is something that you could bring up in discussion. Overall, I think it's a cool move. I like Meteorite dials. I think they're very attractive. I like the way that the movement looks. I think having a smaller case allows me to wear it. So those are all the pros that I can think of when it comes to these releases. And they have a pretty storied history of releasing Omega Speedmasters with Moonphases. So it's kind of in line with a lot of the things that they've done in the past. All right, next up, a really anticipated watch was released by Vacheron Constantin. If you don't know, Vacheron Constantin released in their historique line the 222, a yellow gold reissue of this historique 222, which was for the 45th anniversary of the model, and this was released in 2022. Really well. The reception of this watch was incredible. People loved the fact that they were coming out with it. They didn't make a lot of design modifications to the piece. I think they might have made it just a little bit bigger, but overall kept the overall design and overall sizes and proportions of these watches consistent with that of the original 222. This watch was released in yellow gold, and for the last 3 years, I think everyone has been saying, when will we get a steel model? And so for the 270th anniversary of Vacheron Constantin, it has been released that they will be offering a historic 222 in steel with a really incredible blue dial. It's the reference 4200H/222A. A lot of people have wanted this watch. There's not a whole lot to say. I would encourage you to see the pictures of this watch. The blue dial is really attractive. White accents on the dial as well as the hands. You got your stainless steel case integrated bracelet, beautiful Vacheron Constantin logo at the bottom right lug. Again, not a whole lot to say, but not a whole lot to say in terms of describing this watch. I would say this: thank you, Vacheron Constantin, for releasing this piece. I think they've also priced it fairly well. It's $32,000, which for a time-only sports watch is fairly aggressive. However, if you compare to a lot of the other pieces that would be competing with these watches, I think well priced for those interested in purchasing it. Beautiful watch. I love it. I have nothing more to really say other than that. I'm excited to see this watch in person. I haven't been able to see it in person just yet, but as always, there'll be links in the show notes of this podcast for you to see the 222. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting, for me at least, is, I think the overseas has been at the forefront of sort of the stainless steel sports watch for Vacheron Constantin. And this release, the 222, I think, is in direct competition with the overseas. But I think they've actually allowed, I think the 222, at least up until this point, they haven't introduced sort of complications or anything like that for the 222, and maybe the overseas is the opportunity for them to do those types of things. So they've released 222s with perpetual calendars, for example, and skeletonized dials, so they can kind of play around a little bit more with the overseas and allow the 222 to really remain in their historic lineup where they're focusing on showcasing what they've done in the past. So a good opportunity there. Maybe that could be my criticism, is they've kind of got two watches that might be competing with one another. But hey, we'll see how it goes. And I'll be interested to see how these stack up against the Cubitus from Patek Philippe. So we'll see how things go. All right, the brand that I wanted to discuss about for dial colors is actually Tudor. Tudor decided they were going to release another watch from their Black Bay Chrono lineup of watches. Back in October, they released a fairly low-key piece that was released in with a blue. It was called the Blue Boutique Edition, that had a very sort of South Beach vibe to it. Blue dial, obviously. And they have just released what they're calling the Flamingo Blue Black Bay Chrono, which has quite a nice sort of bright blue. I don't even know if it's bright blue. It's more like, it's flamingo blue in their Black Bay Chrono lineup of watches. The only thing that's different about this specific piece is the dial color. Other than that, it's a classic Black Bay chronograph, 41 millimeter piece in stainless steel with a bracelet running on the MT5813 automatic movement, which is I think it's a cost certified movement as well. Date complication, it's at 3:00 with a 45 minute counter at 3:00, and then your seconds counter at 9:00. Overall, it's another dial color, but I think it's another example of a brand experimenting with dial colors, adding some more non-traditional, colorful pieces to what could be looked at as a fairly mundane group of dial configurations, I guess what you could say. For me, it's, the blue is very, very bright. You really have to like this blue color, probably have to live in a sunny place for you to want this piece. You could also maybe criticize the fact that the case is 41 millimeters with the chronograph hands and a fairly large bezel. It's probably going to sit quite large on your wrist. Again, just trying to find things that I would criticize about this piece. But you're not going to get anything wrong with the cost certified. You're not going to do anything wrong if you purchased one of these pieces with this dial, especially because you've got a cost certified movement, really well manufactured. I think the proportions of the watch are fairly good. I personally might increase the size of the subdials on these watches just a little bit. They do feel a little bit small, and maybe the date is kind of lost at 6:00. Again, these are just observations, but a really nice sort of progression of the Black Bay Chronos. Another dial configuration, not something would make a fairly collectible piece. It's not limited edition either, so you can probably pick these up fairly easily. All right, the last story I want to discuss is another anniversary. So, in October, Oris introduced a new diver's date line as it sort of came up to the 60th anniversary of this model, which is the Diver 65. And this piece is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, and they have released this example. And I think what this example, I think the most striking pieces that of this design that they carried over from sort of the original piece was these really large inverse loomed 3, 6, 9, and 12 hour markers that are sort of framed. This is probably the largest difference between these and other versions of these watches. Overall, it's got this really retro look, which I think is quite attractive. If you like sort of retro divers, I think they're quite nice to look at. Black dial, black bezel, stainless steel case, stainless steel bracelet. The bracelet reminds me of sort of a riveted bracelet, which is kind of cool as well. So you kind of have a nice little nod to the history of divers, nod to the history of Oris. And instead of, staying within the vintage realm, this also has super luminova, so the dial is going to light up a ton when you have this under a low light. Hours, minutes, seconds, complications, no date, anti-shock, and 28 joule movement. Water resistant, up to 100 meters, and then it's running on the Oris 733 movement, which is based off of Sellita-based caliber. 41 hours of power reserve, automatic winding movement. A really attractive and very nice way of sort of nodding to the history of this watch. I'm not a big diver sort of enthusiast. It's just not really the aesthetic that I go for with my personal collection. But those who are looking for sort of a retro diver with modern technology, I'll say, would definitely do well to take a look at this piece. All right, with that said, I think we'll wrap up this episode of Life on the Wrist podcast. Very exciting times. I think brands are now kind of getting into the swing of 2025, releasing some interesting pieces. As always, there will be links in the show notes of this podcast to all of the watches that we discussed today. So if you want to see the articles that are written about those pieces, as well as pictures and videos of these pieces, I encourage you to check out the show notes. While you're there, you will also see links to our social medias as well as our website. So I encourage you to check those out if you are not following us over there. If you are new to Life on the Wrist, be sure to follow this podcast and share this podcast with a friend who might be interested in watches. We'd love to have you part of the Life on the Wrist crew and have you really contribute. One of the things I encourage you always to do is to leave us a review so we can see the feedback that you want, cover things that you really want to hear about on this podcast. And the way that you do that is you can contact us on our website, on our social medias, or you can leave us a rating, and it really does help us out. With this said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.